You know, when we talk about a life-saving cure, there is just this inherent expectation of like universal precision.
Oh, absolutely.
I
Yeah.
mean, think about how we view modern medicine. You have a bacterial infection, right? So the doctor prescribes a specific antibiotic, you take the pill, and it wipes out the bacteria.
Right. It's a very clean, straightforward transaction. Good medicine heals.
Exactly. It doesn't matter if you are, a good person or a bad person, rich or poor. If you have strep throat, penicillin does exactly what penicillin is designed to do.
Yeah. It operates on a strict binary. You take the cure, you get better. And I think we are deeply comforted by that predictability.
We really are.
We like to believe that when we are dealing with ultimate truth or moral instruction or a spiritual remedy, it will just have a guaranteed positive outcome for literally anyone who consumes it.
But what if you step into the landscape of the human heart and suddenly that predictable medicine cabinet is just completely thrown out the window?
Oh, man, yeah. That's where it gets complicated.
Right. What if we are looking at a spiritual reality where the exact same medicine that miraculously cures one person is utterly lethal to another?
It's a heavy thought.
It is. Welcome to Reformed Thinking. If you are joining us today, you are probably stepping away from the endless barrage of self-help podcasts,
Yeah,
right?
10-step leadership guides.
That's exactly the constant modern demand to just optimize your life. But today, we are asking you to step back into the smog and the cobblestones of May 27th, 1855.
Right into the heart of London.
Yes, to look at how ultimate truth actually impacts the human psyche.
And we are spending our time today in a single sermon, which is just fascinating. It was preached at Exeter Hall in the Strand by a very young Charles H. Spurgeon.
Wait, how young was he here?
He was only 20 years old at this time.
That is just crazy to me. 20 years old.
I know, 20, and yet he's drawing these massive, unprecedented crowds. So the sermon is titled The Two Effects of the Gospel, and he is unpacking the words of the Apostle Paul from 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 15 and 16. And I have to say, right up front, the premise he introduces here is something he himself admits is, well, terrifying to even articulate.
It really is terrifying, because the foundational idea we are wrestling with in this deep dive is that the gospel, the literal good news, could actually make things significantly worse for some people.
Right. Not just that it fails to help them, but it actively hurts them.
Yes, that exposure to this truth could actively increase their condemnation and, harden their hearts.
Which is just a staggering claim.
It is. But before we get to the mechanics of how that actually happens, I was really struck by how Spurgeon sets the stage here.
Yeah, he takes a really interesting angle.
Because he doesn't start with the message itself, right? He starts with the mindset of the messenger. He zeroes in on the Apostle Paul.
It creates this incredibly stark contrast between ancient suffering and modern comfort.
Yeah, let's unpack that.
So he draws our attention to a truly astonishing claim Paul makes in the text. Paul says, "Now thanks be unto God, which always causeth us to triumph in Christ."
Okay, wait, let me stop you right there.
Sure.
Because when I hear the word triumph, my brain instantly goes to a very specific set of modern images.
Like what? Winning the Super Bowl.
Right, exactly. I picture a gold medal or, a corner office, the best-selling book, basically a perfectly curated Instagram feed where everything is going flawlessly.
Yeah, the modern American dream version of triumph.
Exactly. To us, triumph means you won. It means you conquered the obstacle and now you are standing on top of the mountain just, enjoying the view.
And that is exactly the modern, almost toxic positivity definition of the word that Spurgeon wants to just shatter right out of the gate.
He really goes after it.
He does. He immediately grounds that word in the brutal physical reality of Paul's actual historical life. He asks his audience to literally look at the man who is claiming this so-called triumph.
And this is not a pretty picture.
Not at all. I mean, this is a man who was beaten 5 times with 40 stripes minus 1.
Just think about the physical toll of just one of those beatings.
Right, let alone 5. He was dragged out of a city and left for dead. He suffered shipwreck. He was locked in the stocks. He was stoned.
It's just endless trauma.
It really is. He walked through whole seas of persecution, enduring the absolute hatred and the hiss of the entire world. And yet, sitting in the aftermath of all that, he writes, God always causes us to triumph.
It makes absolutely no sense. I mean, I was thinking about it like this. It's like claiming you just won the Boston Marathon while you were currently bleeding out in the back of an
That's
ambulance.
a perfect analogy, yeah.
How can Paul say he is triumphing when, by every single measurable earthly metric, he is being actively destroyed by the world?
And that tension, that cognitive dissonance, is exactly what Spurgeon wants us to sit in.
Why?
Because he contrasts Paul with the ministers of his own day, in 1855. And frankly, the contrast holds up just as well today, if not more so. Spurgeon says that if a modern minister, someone who enjoys the world's applause, has a wealthy, admiring congregation, lives in a nice house with peace and ease, and who doesn't have a single critic wagging their tongue against him.
Basically a celebrity pastor.
Exactly. If that guy stands up and says, God always causes us to triumph, it means very little.
Right, because it's easy to claim God is giving you victory when your life is already perfectly comfortable.
Exactly. But for a hero like Paul, trampled, distressed, and bleeding, to claim triumph, that reveals a profoundly different definition of what victory actually is.
Okay, so what is his definition then?
Well, what do you think it is, looking at the text?
Because it clearly isn't physical safety, right? And it isn't popularity or a growing platform. He has to be anchoring his hope at something entirely outside of his physical circumstances.
And his anchor is found entirely in the second half of that verse. Paul says, God maketh manifest the savour of his knowledge by us in every place.
Oh,
That is the triumph. The victory isn't in the messenger's comfort. It is simply in the fact that the message is being broadcast.
so Paul's comfort is that God's purposes are being perfectly fulfilled, completely independent of human suffering.
Right. He doesn't view himself as the main character of the story.
He views himself as the instrument.
Yes.
And this goes right back to our core Reformed understanding of God's sovereignty, right?
Absolutely.
Paul isn't relying on some sort of first century prosperity gospel where obedience equals earthly ease. His peace is completely anchored in the fact that God is sovereignly ensuring the truth goes out.
The victory is the proclamation itself.
Exactly. But I really want to dig into this because it feels so counterintuitive to how we are wired.
Yeah.
Is Spurgeon saying that Paul simply didn't care about his own pain, like he was just some sort of stoic robot?
No, not a robot at all. Paul clearly felt the pain. I mean, he writes extensively about his despair and his suffering in his other epistles.
Right, the whole disparity even of life passage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Spurgeon is pointing out a fundamental psychological shift in how Paul processes that pain.
Okay, break that down for me.
Well, if you believe that you are an ambassador for the sovereign king of the universe, right?
Hmm.
And you know that the king has ordained that your specific suffering is the exact vehicle through which his message will be delivered to a certain town or even a specific prison guard.
Then the suffering suddenly has meaning.
Precisely. Spurgeon says that with this thought, that God makes manifest the savor of his knowledge, a minister can peacefully lay his head on his pillow. And with this thought, he can open his eyes in heaven.
So the pressure to manufacture a successful, pain-free life is entirely removed,
It's gone.
which is a beautiful, deeply liberating thought for the messenger. But it immediately creates this massive theological collision for the people hearing the message.
It really does.
Because if the triumph is simply that the message is sovereignly proclaimed, we have to look at what happens when that message actually lands on human ears.
Right. What is the actual effect?
And that leads to this terrifying dual nature of the message, the vastly different effects of the exact same gospel.
Yeah, if the medicine is perfect, why do some patients die?
Exactly.
Spurgeon uses this brilliant analogy from nature to explain the mechanics of this, and it's super helpful. He asks us to consider the sun.
The actual sun in the sky.
Right. The sun shines in its brilliance, pouring down the exact same rays of light and heat. There's no variation in the sun itself.
Okay.
But those identical rays will moisten and melt a piece of wax, and they will completely harden and bake a piece of clay.
That is just such a vivid way to explain it.
Isn't it?
Because the variable isn't the sun. The sun is doing exactly what it always does. It is radiating heat.
Right.
The variable is the structural nature of the material receiving the light.
Exactly. And he expands on this by pointing to the tropics.
Oh, I love this part.
He notes that the incredible flood of sunlight in the tropics produces the most luxuriant vegetation, right? The choicest fruits, the fairest flowers on earth. It brings forth abundant, vibrant life. But simultaneously, that exact same tropical environment with that exact same sun brings forth the worst reptiles, the most venomous snakes, and the deadliest plagues.
So the heat that gives life also, like, ferments death.
Exactly.
So applying this to the biblical text, Spurgeon is arguing that the gospel of Jesus Christ is God's absolute best to humanity. It is the Son of righteousness.
Right.
But to some people, it becomes what Paul literally calls a savor of death unto death. It actively produces spiritual death.
And Spurgeon is very, very careful to clarify the mechanics here, because we cannot blame the gospel for this.
Right. It is not the fault of God's truth.
No, it is the fault of the human heart that rejects it, hates it, scoffs at it, and opposes it.
The mechanism here is so vital to understand because when a person hears the ultimate truth of grace and chooses to reject it, they don't just stay neutral.
Right, they don't just go back to zero.
No, the act of rejection fundamentally changes the chemistry of their heart.
That's a great way to put it.
Every single time you say no to the truth, your heart builds a thicker callus. The clay gets harder. The gospel doesn't ruin them by being evil. It ruins them because their aggressive resistance to its goodness solidifies their rebellion.
Yeah.
But I want to pause here, though,
Okay.
because I can hear a listener right now thinking, wait, if God is the one who created the human heart, and God knows that someone's heart is like clay, isn't God ultimately responsible when the sun hardens it?
The classic pushback.
Right. That feels deeply unfair to our modern sensibilities. How is that not God actively forcing them to be evil? Walk me through that tension, because that is the defining objection to Reformed theology.
It really is the most natural objection in the world.
Yeah.
But we have to look at what Reformed theology actually teaches about the state of the human heart before the sun ever even shines on it.
Okay, let's go there.
We believe in total depravity.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean humans are as evil as they could possibly be, like we aren't all serial killers.
Right.
But it means that every single part of our nature is fallen and naturally hostile to God. We are all, by default, clay.
We are born as clay.
Yes, we are all naturally inclined to reject God's authority because fundamentally we want to be our own gods.
So it isn't that God takes neutral, innocent people who are just minding their own business and maliciously turns them into clay.
Exactly. We are already clay. We are already in a state of active rebellion.
Okay, I track with that.
So when the sun of the gospel shines, it simply exposes and accelerates the nature that is already there. The hardening is a result of the person's own willful, persistent choice to say, I will not bow to this.
Wow.
Now, the miracle of grace, which we will get to later in the deep dive, is that God can sovereignly reach in and change a heart of stone into a heart of flesh. He can essentially turn clay into wax.
The new birth.
Right. But when he doesn't do that, when he simply lets a person have exactly what they want, which is autonomy and distance from him, the natural result of their own rejection is a harder heart.
So God is not the author of their sin.
Not at all. He is simply allowing the sun to shine on the clay they have actively chosen to be.
That makes perfect sense. It's a terrifying reality, but it places the responsibility squarely on the human will that is, actively resisting the light.
Yeah.
But it's interesting how Spurgeon narrows in on what kind of message is actually being preached here. Because before he talks about the true gospel hardening people, he attacks a fake gospel that he claims is a savor of death to literally everyone who hears it.
Oh, yes. This is a fascinating psychological detour he takes. He attacks what he calls legal preaching.
Okay, let's define that for the listener, because legal preaching sounds like something you hear in a courtroom, not a church.
Right. So in a theological context, legal preaching means preaching mere morality.
Just rules.
Exactly. It is preaching the law without the gospel. It's the pastor, or frankly, the modern self-help guru, whose entire message boils down to, here are the rules, be a better person.
Stop drinking, stop lying, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and, earn God's favor.
Yes. And Spurgeon says this kind of preaching is very admired in theory, but in practice, it is completely ineffectual. In fact, he argues it actually injures morality.
Okay, I have to push back on that.
Look for it.
How can telling people to be good actually injure morality? I mean, if I stand in front of a room of people and say, hey, stop stealing and start being kind, isn't that just a net positive for society? How does yelling rules at people make them worse?
To understand this, we really have to look at the psychology of human rebellion. Modern psychologists actually call this reactance.
Reactance.
Yeah. When human beings feel their autonomy is being threatened by strict rules, especially when those rules highlight their own inadequacies, their natural psychological response is to rebel against the rule just to prove their freedom.
Oh, wow. Okay, think about diet culture.
Yes. Perfect example.
The exact moment you tell yourself, I am absolutely forbidden from eating sugar under penalty of extreme guilt, what is the only thing you can think about?
Sugar. You will aggressively crave it.
Exactly. The law itself creates the desire to break it.
And Paul explicitly says this in Romans 7. He says he wouldn't have known what coveting was if the law hadn't said, do not covet.
Right.
But sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, produced in him every kind of coveting.
That is why.
When you preach mere morality to a spiritually dead person, you are essentially dangling a mirror in front of a corpse, showing them how dead they are, and then yelling at them to breathe.
Wow.
It only produces despair or hypocrisy or just deeper rebellion.
And Spurgeon brings the historical receipts to back this up, too. He points to examples that would have been very familiar to his London audience. Like he brings up John Berridge, this well-known English clergyman.
Yeah, Berridge is a perfect case study for this. He famously admitted that for years he preached the strictest morality. He just hammered the law from the pulpit.
And what was his own assessment of his success after doing that for years?
He said he preached morality until there was not a single moral man left in his village.
That is incredibly stark. His preaching actively degraded the town.
It did. And then Spurgeon brings up an even more famous figure, Thomas Chalmers.
All right, Chalmers.
Chalmers was a brilliant mind, a towering figure in Scottish theology. But Chalmers confessed that for the first several years of his ministry, before he truly experienced a spiritual awakening himself, he preached nothing but precepts.
So just pure law.
Pure law. He preached vehemently against the evils of drunkenness. He preached against the heinousness of swearing. He laid out the logical, the societal, and the moral reasons why these vices were destroying his parishioners' lives.
And what was the result of all that brilliant, logical, moral lecturing?
Zero. Chalmers said he never saw a single drunkard reclaimed. He never heard a single swearer stop swearing.
Amazing.
The moral lecture completely failed to move the needle on human behavior.
So what changed for him? Because we know Chalmers eventually led massive revivals and saw incredible societal transformation.
What changed was the message itself. It wasn't until Chalmers began to preach the love of Jesus and the grace of the gospel that things shifted.
Oh, wow.
When he stopped saying, do this to be saved, and started preaching, you are saved by grace through faith, is a free gift of God, now look at what Christ has done for you. That is when the transformation happened.
The affections changed.
Yes. Chalmers noted that when he finally preached salvation by faith, drunkards left their cups by the shoals, thieves became honest, and ungodly people bowed to Jesus.
That is just a stunning vindication of Reformed theology regarding the nature of salvation.
It really is.
Because if a person is spiritually dead, as Ephesians says, dead in trespasses and sins, then giving them a moral checklist is totally useless. You are just giving instructions to a cadaver.
Right.
It requires a supernatural miracle of grace, like an infusion of new life, to change anything. You can't regulate a dead heart into beating. You have to replace it.
Which brings us to a massive, really uncomfortable question for anyone listening today.
Yeah, let's bring this to the present.
Look at our modern world. Look at our political discourse, our social media, our cultural commentary.
It's a mess.
It is. And how often do we try to fix deep, systemic, societal problems by just yelling rules at people?
Constantly.
We think if we just enforce better morality, or if we just shame people enough for their vices, or if we cancel them for failing to meet the moral standard of the day, we can somehow fix the culture.
But Spurgeon and Chalmers and Berridge and, frankly, all of human history show us that merely exposing the evil of a vice doesn't cure it.
No, it doesn't. Only the grace of the gospel transforms the affections of the heart.
That is so profound. We are basically a society addicted to legal preaching, just in a secular format.
Oh, that's exactly what it is, secular legalism.
We are constantly yelling rules at each other online, and we are shocked when society keeps getting worse. It's because the law cannot give life.
Yeah.
Okay, so preaching mere rules fails. It's a dead end. But this leads us into what I think is the darkest, most intense part of Spurgeon's entire sermon.
Brace yourselves, yeah.
Because we have to ask, what happens when people do hear the true grace of the gospel, but their hearts remain like that clay in the sun?
Right. They hear the message of free grace, but they remain hard.
Exactly. This is where Spurgeon shifts his focus to the sanctuary sinner.
The sanctuary sinner. Those are not the atheists out in the street.
No.
These are the people with the hardest, most quiet consciences who are sitting right inside the church walls.
It's chilling.
They sit under a faithful ministry. They hear the stern warnings. They hear the offer of grace. But they weaponize the grace they hear.
He shares a very vivid, almost shocking anecdote here about a man in a pub, or a public house as he calls it.
Yeah, this story is intense.
He describes this guy standing on top of a table with a glass of ale in his hand, just preaching to the drunkards around him. And the man announces to the crowd, "Mates, I can say more than any of you. I am elect. I am one of those who are redeemed with Jesus' precious blood."
Unbelievable.
Right. And after claiming that God has unconditionally chosen to save him, he downs his tumbler of ale, dances in front of them, and starts singing these vile, blasphemous songs.
Spurgeon's reaction to this imagery is just visceral. He says this man is taking the pure truth of the gospel, which he calls the knife meant to open the secrets of grace, and he is driving it directly into his own heart.
He literally calls it spiritual suicide.
Yes, the man is using the highest, most beautiful truth of God's sovereign grace as a panderer for his vice. He uses the gospel as a scaffold to build up his own wickedness.
I am so glad Spurgeon brings this up, honestly, because if you are listening to this deep dive and you aren't super familiar with Reformed theology, you might be thinking, wait a minute, isn't that the exact critique people have of Calvinism?
Oh, absolutely.
The idea of unconditional election, that God chooses who will be saved before the foundation of the world, entirely regardless of their future actions or good works. Doesn't that just give people a theological license to sin?
That's the common fear, yes.
Doesn't that doctrine naturally create guys dancing on pub tables saying, "I'm elect, so it doesn't matter what I do"?
It's the classic historical accusation of antinomianism.
Break that word down.
Anti meaning against, and nomos meaning law. The idea that grace frees you from any moral obligation whatsoever.
Right.
But Spurgeon firmly, fiercely shuts this down. He addresses anyone who loves to hear the doctrines of grace, but lives an impure life. And he says to them, "Be it known unto you that ye are liars and hypocrites, for the truth is not in you at all."
He does not pull his punches.
No, he doesn't.
But explain the mechanics of why the man on the table is a liar. Like, if election is truly unconditional, why is his bad behavior proof that he isn't elect?
Because in Reformed theology, election is never, ever separated from sanctification.
Okay, that's key.
God doesn't just elect a person to be forgiven. He elects them to be transformed.
Yeah.
Spurgeon leans heavily on the biblical truth that a good tree cannot bring forth corrupt fruit.
A bad tree produces bad fruit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He states, if any man is born of God, he cannot sin. Now, we have to clarify, he doesn't mean a Christian never makes a mistake or never stumbles.
Right. None of us are perfect.
What he means is a true believer cannot live in a habitual, unrepentant, unbroken pattern of joyful sin.
Joyful sin, that's the distinction.
Yes. If you are truly elect, the Holy Spirit resides in you. You will not be suffered to fall into continual sin. It will be your life's deepest endeavor to keep near to Jesus. You will hate your sin.
So the proof of election isn't just, a mental agreement with a theological concept.
Yeah.
The proof of election is the fruit of a transformed life. The man on the pub table is taking a profound truth and twisting it just to quiet his own conscience.
And because he is doing that, the gospel becomes a savor of death to him.
And Spurgeon takes this even further. He argues that hearing the gospel and abusing it actually increases a person's condemnation at the final judgment.
He says it will literally make hell hotter for them.
It is a deeply sobering concept, and it comes down to the theological and legal principle of sinning against the light.
Right. Spurgeon compares someone who has never heard the gospel. He uses the term Hottentot, which was a 19th century term for an indigenous person in Africa without exposure to Christian teaching.
Yeah.
He compares them to a Londoner who has been tutored in piety from their youth. He argues that the person who has been given the light of truth has a far, far greater responsibility.
The light we have becomes the very measure of our guilt. Let's create an analogy for this to make it really clear for you listening.
Go for it.
Imagine a man who is wandering in the pitch black of night. He stumbles into a restricted area and accidentally knocks over a priceless artifact. It's a crime, it's a tragedy, but he was in the dark.
Right, he didn't see it.
Now imagine another man. He is standing in a brightly lit room. He has a spotlight shining directly on the artifact. He reads the warning signs. And then, looking directly at the security camera, he takes a hammer and willfully smashes the artifact to pieces.
The law views those two crimes very, very differently, doesn't it?
Exactly. The first man is guilty of trespassing and negligence, but the second man is guilty of aggressive, premeditated malice.
And Spurgeon says that what a wanderer in the dark might do without realizing the severity of the crime is the absolute height of transgression for someone who has the light of the gospel blazing on their eyeballs.
Because they have actively opposed God's devised scheme of mercy. It's not just breaking a rule, it is insulting the remedy.
He asks to imagine the guilt of those who stood in Jerusalem and cried, "Crucify him."
Yeah.
Or the modern infidel who reads the Bible, understands the claims of Christ, and then publicly calls him a charlatan, abuses God's ministers, and scoffs at the truth.
God will not forget that they took his greatest gift of benevolence, the very blood of his son, and literally spat on it. The knowledge they possessed is what condemns them.
But the tragedy doesn't just wait for the next world. Spurgeon points out a fascinating psychological reality about the present.
What's that?
He says that this savor of death brings intense misery in this world, too. He argues that the gospel completely ruins the enjoyment of sin.
This might be my favorite insight in the entire deep dive today. How does the gospel ruin sin?
He argues that a drunkard or a libertine or a greedy businessman could actually revel in their vices with much greater joy if they didn't have the whisper of God's warnings freezing the current of their soul.
So ignorance would actually be bliss.
Exactly. But because they have heard the truth, their conscience is awake.
Yes. If they didn't have the verse, the wages of sin is death, just echoing in the back of their minds, they could just party in peace. They could live with utter abandon.
But they can't.
Right, because the truth they heard in Sunday school or from a friend or on a podcast puts bitter in their cup. Spurgeon compares the gospel to the skeleton at the Egyptian feast.
That's a profound historical metaphor we should really unpack.
Yeah, explain the Egyptian feast thing.
So the ancient Egyptians had this morbid but fascinating custom. At the height of a joyous banquet, when the wine was flowing and the music was loud, they would sometimes bring a wooden carving of a skeleton into the room.
That is wild.
And they would drag it around the tables to remind everyone of their mortality. Spurgeon is saying that the truth of the gospel acts exactly like that skeleton for the unbeliever who knows the truth but rejects it.
Think about it like having a blaring smoke detector in your house that you physically cannot turn off.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
You want to just sit on your couch, watch TV, and ignore the fire you've started in the kitchen. You want to enjoy your comfort. But this piercing, high-pitched alarm keeps interrupting your peace.
And the gospel won't let them enjoy their destruction.
By day, they might laugh it off, right? They might mock the church, but in the quiet of the evening, when they are alone in their beds, the thought of judgment makes them quiver.
Immortality, which should be this glorious thought, becomes the absolute misery of their existence because they know they are despising the only mercy available.
If the gospel doesn't soften you, it actively hardens you and makes you miserable.
It's a heavy, heavy reality. But thankfully, after sitting in that intense darkness, Spurgeon brilliantly pivots.
Yes, thank goodness.
He reminds his listeners that the text doesn't just say the gospel is a savor of death. It is also a savor of life unto life.
And to describe the joy of this spiritual awakening, he uses such a beautiful, tender anecdote. He talks about a woman he knew who had been completely deaf for 40 or 50 years.
He describes a specific morning. She was sitting at her cottage door, and suddenly, miraculously, her ear was opened.
Just like that.
Just like that. And a vehicle was passing by on the rough cobblestone road outside. And to her newly opened ears, the grating, clunky sound of a wooden cart rumbling over stones sounded like the melodious music of heaven.
Why? Because it was the first sound she had heard in half a century.
Exactly. The sound itself wasn't inherently musical, but the ability to hear it made it glorious. Spurgeon uses this to describe what it is like when the Holy Spirit sovereignly opens a dead sinner's spiritual ears.
I want you, listening to this right now, to just put yourself in the shoes of that deaf woman and then map that onto your own spiritual life.
Yeah, that's a great exercise.
Think about how we get so used to hearing truth. We go to church, we read theology books, we listen to deep dive podcasts. We get so saturated in the language of grace that it just becomes background noise.
It becomes the hum of the refrigerator.
Exactly. We critique the pastor's delivery. We argue over minor doctrinal points online. But to someone who has been spiritually dead, whose heart has just been awakened by the Holy Spirit for the very first time, even a clumsy, rough, ineloquent presentation of grace sounds like absolute heaven.
Jesus Christ died for sinners.
Yes. When your ears are first opened, that simple sentence is a savor of life.
And this is where Spurgeon's theological precision really shines. He insists that if this gospel is truly a savor of life, it must be a savor of life unto life.
Unto life.
Right. It cannot be a savor of life unto death. He uses this phrase to launch into a fierce unapologetic defense of the perseverance of the saints, the Reformed doctrine of eternal security.
Oh, he goes right for the throat here. He mounts a direct, aggressive attack on Arminian theology.
He really does. And for those who might not be completely familiar with the terms, Arminianism is a theological system that, among other things, suggests that a person can be genuinely saved, given spiritual life, and yet through their own future sin or loss of faith, ultimately lose that salvation and die eternally.
So you can fall away.
Right. It posits that a man can be justified and forgiven by God today, and yet have those same transgressions laid back on his shoulders tomorrow if he falls away.
Spurgeon absolutely despises this idea. He calls it a doctrine of lies.
He says the Arminian gospel is the shell without the kernel, the husk without the fruit.
Because if salvation is dependent on my ability to hold on to God rather than God's ability to hold on to me, I have zero real security. And to prove how absurd he finds this theology, he creates this incredibly dramatic, almost cinematic hypothetical dialogue set in hell.
It is a masterclass in rhetorical framing.
Yeah, it really is.
He asks us to imagine a scenario where the Arminian doctrine is true. So imagine one true believer washed in the blood of Christ somehow loses their salvation and ends up in hell.
Okay, picture this.
You picture Satan holding up this lost soul, this gem that once belonged to Christ, and just mocking Jesus.
Imagine the scene, the devil standing in the flames, holding up a soul and yelling to heaven, "Aha! Prince of light and glory, I have one of thy jewels. Thou didst die for this man, but thou hadst not strength enough to save him. Thou didst love him once. Where is thy love? It is not worth having. You started a work you could not finish."
And then the theological hammer really drops. Spurgeon imagines Satan not just mocking Christ's power, but taunting God's justice.
This is the crazy part.
Satan says, "This man was forgiven. Behold the justice of God. He is to be punished after he is forgiven. Christ suffered for this man's sins on the cross, and yet I have him afterwards, for God exacted the punishment twice."
Wait, stop. God exacted the punishment twice. I really need us to drill down into this because this is the absolute core of the Reformed doctrine of definite atonement, sometimes called limited atonement.
Let's unpack it.
Let's build a courtroom analogy to explain this double jeopardy idea.
Okay, I love a good courtroom analogy.
Imagine a judge sitting on the bench. A young man is standing before him, guilty of a massive financial crime. The fine is $1 million.
Big fine.
The young man has $0. The judge is just about to sentence him to prison when a wealthy benefactor steps into the courtroom, approaches the bench, and pays the $1 million fine in full, in cash, on behalf of the young man.
Okay, so the receipt is stamped.
The debt is cleared.
Right. The law is completely satisfied.
Exactly. Now, what would we say about the judge if, the very next day, he arrested the young man again and threw him in prison for the exact same debt that was already paid?
We would say the judge is corrupt.
Yes.
It is fundamentally unjust to demand payment twice for the exact same crime.
Yeah.
It violates the very nature of justice.
Yes. And that is exactly Spurgeon's point about the cross.
It is.
If Jesus Christ actually literally paid for a specific person's sins on the cross, if he drank the cup of God's wrath for that individual, the debt is completely cleared.
Paid in full.
For God to later send that person to hell to pay for those exact same sins again would make God an unjust judge. It would be cosmic double jeopardy.
And by framing the loss of salvation as an insult to Christ's power and a direct assault on God's justice, Spurgeon elevates the entire conversation.
He takes it out of the realm of human effort.
Exactly. It's no longer a debate about our human performance or our daily moral willpower or our ability to maintain faith. The focus is shifted entirely to divine sovereignty, the efficacy of the cross, and the immutable justice of God.
As Spurgeon quotes, "Whom he loves to the end."
He says that if he believed he was on the same footing after conversion as he was before, meaning he could still be lost, then conversion would be of no use at all.
It would just be a temporary reprieve.
Right. But because Jesus says, "I give unto my sheep eternal life, and they shall never perish," the believer is secure. It is life unto life eternal.
So we have firmly established that this gospel is a powerful dual-natured force. It sovereignly melts some and hardens others, and that eternal outcome, whether wax or clay, is entirely in the hands of a sovereign God. But this naturally creates a massive, very practical problem for anyone who is actually trying to do ministry or raise kids or share their faith.
Right, the application of all this.
Because if the exact same message saves one and hardens another, and if that outcome is purely a sovereign act of God, then how do I measure my own success?
It's a great question.
If I'm a pastor, how do I know if I'm doing a good job? If I'm a parent teaching my kids about Jesus, how do I know if I'm failing?
Especially because we live in a society driven entirely by metrics and KPIs, right?
Key performance indicators, exactly. If a CEO's sales are down, the board fires him. If a podcaster's downloads drop, they lose their sponsors.
If a church isn't growing, the pastor assumes he is failing.
So how does Spurgeon address this metrics-obsessed anxiety?
Well, he tackles this paradox head on, and his thesis completely subverts our modern corporate mindset.
How so?
He states plainly, the minister is absolutely not responsible for his success.
Say that again.
He is not responsible for success. Yeah. He is accountable for his life, his actions, his earnestness, and the purity of what he preaches. But he is not responsible for other people's souls.
Wow.
He uses 3 distinct biblical metaphors to explain how this works in practice.
Let's walk through those because they are incredibly helpful.
First, he looks at the title of an ambassador. An ambassador is sent by a king as a plenipotentiary, a representative with full power to deliver terms of peace to a foreign warring nation.
Okay.
The ambassador's job is to use all his talents, to plead the case, to clearly explain the terms, and to show how destructive the war will be if they refuse.
Okay, so the ambassador travels to the enemy king, delivers the flawless presentation, and the enemy king haughtily rejects the terms and declares war.
Right.
What happens when the ambassador goes home?
That's the crucial point. His king doesn't execute him.
Right.
The king doesn't say, you failed, you're fired. The king says, you did your duty. You delivered my terms accurately and faithfully. The fact that they chose war and destruction is entirely on their own heads.
The ambassador is judged on his faithfulness to the message, not on the reception of the enemy.
Exactly.
That immediately lifts so much weight off my shoulders. Okay, what's the second metaphor?
The second title is The Fisherman. He notes that a fisherman is not responsible for the quantity of fish he catches, but for how he fishes.
Oh, this is where he throws some shade.
He really does. He throws some serious, historically biting critique at the polished elite ministers of his day.
He goes right after the academic snobs here.
He critiques the men who fish with elegant silk lines and gold and silver hooks.
What does that mean, practically?
He is talking about preachers who use nicely polished phrases, perfectly manicured, academically dense sermons that sound beautiful to the cultural elite.
But the problem is...
The fish simply don't bite. They catch no souls. Meanwhile, Spurgeon says, the men of a rougher order, the unpolished, earnest preachers using standard, maybe less aesthetically pleasing nets, are catching hundreds.
But even then, the core of the metaphor is what the master says to the fisherman at the end of the day. The master doesn't ask, did you catch 1,000 fish? He asks, did you labor? Did you throw the net into the sea in the time of storms?
Yes. If the fisherman worked all night and caught absolutely nothing, God says, I could have sent thee a shoal, if it so pleased me. I given my sovereignty where I please.
Yeah.
But as for thee, thou hast well labored, therefore there is thy reward.
And this connects beautifully to his third metaphor, which is the sower.
Yeah, the sower.
Yeah.
A farmer doesn't hold the sower responsible for the harvest. The sower's only job is to scatter the right seed across the field.
If the seed falls by the wayside and birds eat it, the sower isn't blamed. He didn't make the birds. He didn't pave the road. He just did his duty.
Spurgeon paints this beautiful imaginative picture of a sower getting to heaven with just one single sheaf of wheat on his shoulder.
Just one.
And he tells the master, I sowed upon the rock all my life, and it wouldn't grow. I saw no success. But one seed on a chance Sunday morning was blown awry by the wind, fell on a prepared heart, and this is my one sheaf.
And Spurgeon says the angels will shout, Hallelujah, because one sheaf grown from a rock brings more honor to God's sovereign power than 1,000 sheaves grown from fertile soil.
Let's apply this to the listener right now because this is so freeing. Think about where you feel like you are failing.
Yeah.
Maybe you have been sharing your faith with a skeptical, hostile coworker for years and they just mock you. Maybe you are a parent trying to teach theology to a stubborn teenager who rolls their eyes at everything you say.
Or you're leading a small group and nobody seems to be growing.
Right. Your responsibility ends at faithful, earnest communication. The internal spiritual transformation of the person receiving the message is completely out of your hands. It is God's work.
Okay, wait. I have to push back a little on this.
Sure.
Because human nature being what it is, doesn't telling a leader or a minister or a parent that they aren't responsible for the results just give them a massive excuse to be lazy.
I can see how you think that.
I mean, can't a terrible pastor just say, While my church is dying, I don't repair my sermons, I don't visit the sick, I don't care. But hey, God is sovereign, so the lack of results isn't my fault. How does Spurgeon prevent this doctrine from creating apathy?
It's a very fair question, but Spurgeon's text destroys that excuse. Because while he removes the responsibility for the outcome, he radically turns up the heat on the effort.
Okay, show me where.
Notice the specific language he uses. He praises the fishermen for casting the net in the storms.
Ah.
He praises the sheer earnestness of the endeavor. He explicitly states that degrees of glory in heaven are not based on the volume of success, but on the earnestness of our striving to do the right thing with all our heart.
Okay, so it's the difference between failing because the fish didn't bite versus failing because you never even took the boat out of the dock.
Precisely.
You aren't responsible for making the fish bite, but you are absolutely responsible for getting in the boat, braving the freezing weather, and throwing the heavy net with everything you have.
Exactly. The sovereignty of God is a comfort for the exhausted laborer. It is not an excuse for the lazy sluggard.
That is a great distinction.
And just in case anyone thinks this lack of responsibility for the outcome makes the job of a messenger easy, Spurgeon finishes his sermon by explaining the agonizing psychological pressure of simply being a faithful messenger.
Right. This brings us to the final movement of his argument, which is the weight of the work.
It's a heavy burden.
If you are going to be an ambassador delivering a message that literally determines life and death, a message that might harden your audience against you, it is not child's play.
Spurgeon is ruthlessly critical of what he calls man-made ministers.
He does not hold back.
He looks out at the landscape of 1855 London, and he says there are men in the pulpit who would have made excellent sea captains, or who could have waited well at a store counter, but who were never intended by God for the ministry.
He describes them as being crammed with literature at university, turned out ready dressed in clerical robes, and they just stand there and read their carefully prepared manuscripts, sotto voce.
Meaning softly, sweetly, in a subdued voice.
Right, just to keep the wealthy people in the pews pleased. He even quotes a man named Joseph Irons, saying, "God be with many of them, if it be only to make them hold their tongues."
It's a biting critique of treating the proclamation of truth as a mere trade, like being a banker or a lawyer.
Yeah.
Spurgeon argues that a true minister must have a solemn, agonizing call and possess the Spirit of God.
Yeah.
Because if you are going to faithfully preach this dual-natured gospel, knowing it will make some people hate you, you have to navigate intense psychological temptations.
He lists these temptations, and honestly, they are incredibly relevant today, whether you are a podcaster, a writer, a pastor, or just a person on social media.
Oh, totally. Let's go through them.
First, he talks about the urge to warp your own prejudices. You know you need to speak a hard truth, but your internal monologue says, if I say that, I'm condemning my own behavior or the behavior of my friends.
So you subtly soften the edge of the truth.
Exactly. Second, the fear of displeasing the rich or influential. You look at your congregation or your donor base or your subscriber list and you think, if I preach this specific doctrine, so-and-so will be highly offended and they pay the bills. I'd better leave that part out.
We see that everywhere today. The pressure to conform to the cultural elite.
It's immense. Third, he warns about the danger of the crowd's applause. Spurgeon warns that if you edit the truth to win the multitude, you are playing a very dangerous game.
Because the exact same crowd that cries Hosanna today will cry, crucify him tomorrow.
Human applause is intoxicating, but it is incredibly fickle.
And finally, he mentions the sharp knife of criticism. When you preach truth, the arrows of those who hate your master will inevitably hit you.
And the temptation is to constantly defend yourself, right? To get into the mud with your detractors, to reply to every negative comment.
But Spurgeon offers profound wisdom here. He says the wise man ignores detractors. He uses this majestic imagery, saying like the eagle cares not for the chattering of the sparrows, or like the lion will not turn aside to rend the snarling jackal.
I love that. The eagle doesn't stop soaring just because a sparrow is chirping at it.
Right.
The weight of standing up week after week, proclaiming unsearchable riches, knowing it will harden some and melt others, knowing you will be criticized and misunderstood, is immense. It requires a supernatural endurance.
It really does.
And to drive home the eternal stakes of this earnestness, Spurgeon introduces a concept that I found truly haunting: the starless crown.
This is one of the most sobering, reflective moments in the entire sermon. Spurgeon talks about a person who makes it to heaven. They are genuinely saved by sovereign mercy. They are eternally secure. They escape the flames. But when they arrive, they receive a crown with no stars in it.
Why?
Because they were never the instrument of winning a single soul to righteousness. They lived their entire Christian life in silent comfort.
He directly challenges the different types of people in his audience. He looks at the mother and asks, "What sayest thou to be in heaven without one of thy children to deck thy brow with a star?"
That cuts deep.
It does. He asks the minister how it will feel to be a polished, celebrated preacher on earth, but to stand in heaven with no star. He asks the writer, saying, even if they write as gloriously as John Milton and have huge folios in earthly libraries, how will it feel to look back and realize you won no eternal stars?
It's a radical call to an eternal perspective. Earthly fame, literary success, wealth. It is all dust compared to being the instrument of someone's eternal salvation.
And because the burden of this calling is so heavy, because the messenger is so weak and the human heart is so hard, Spurgeon ends his sermon with an impassioned plea for prayer.
He basically looks at his congregation and says, "My entire ministry depends on you."
He says that losing his prayer book or his notes would be bad, but losing the prayers of his people would put him in a dreadful, ruined condition.
He explicitly credits the massive historic gatherings at Exeter Hall not to his own rhetorical talent, but to the multitude of praying people who met every Monday evening to beg God for a blessing.
He says, all our perils are nothing so long as we have prayer. But if he were given the polite, the noble, the wealthy, and all earthly influence, he would fail utterly without a praying church.
It is a stunning admission of absolute dependence on God's sovereignty. The messenger is just a voice. God must do the work.
So let's pull all these threads together. We've seen that the gospel is a powerful, polarizing force. It is the sun that melts the wax of the elect and bakes the clay of the rebellious.
Yes.
It ruins the enjoyment of sin for the wicked, acting like a skeleton at their feast, but it sounds like the sweetest, most glorious music to the awakened heart of the deaf.
And for those of us called to share it, our only job is to be the faithful ambassador, broadcasting the seed on rocks and soil alike, braving the storms in our little boats, and leaving the eternal results completely in the hands of a sovereign God.
And this brings us right to you, the listener. We have to apply these 19th century truths to our 21st century lives.
I want you to ask yourself, where are you acting like those man-made ministers? Where in your life are you softening the edges of the truth with silk lines just to please the crowd or to keep the peace with the influential people in your family or your workplace?
Are you altering the message of grace because you are secretly taking responsibility for the outcome, trying to manipulate people into believing?
Or on the flip side, are you the one sitting in the pew? Are you sitting under the truth every single week, hearing the gospel of grace on podcasts and in sermons, but letting it become the skeleton at the feast?
Are you getting so used to the light, so familiar with the theology, that you are using it as an excuse to live comfortably in your sin, rather than letting it radically transform your affections?
Spurgeon warned his 1855 audience that the light they received would become the very measure of their guilt if they rejected it. The more you know, the more responsible you are for what you know.
And that leads us to our final provocative thought for today's deep dive. We started by talking about a medicine that cures one and kills another, but I want you to look at the sheer volume of that medicine available to us right now.
It's staggering.
You are living in an era where you have a supercomputer in your pocket. You have more access to truth, to sound theology, to historical sermons, to commentaries, and to biblical information than any generation in the entire history of the human race.
You are absolutely swimming in light. The Hottentot Spurgeon mentioned would weep for a fraction of the access you have.
But here is the question. Is our unprecedented 247 access to this light actually becoming our greatest liability? If the exact same medicine that cures the humble actively hardens the proud, what are you doing with the light you have right now?